Okay, good. I'm getting a few yeses. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's get right into it. Temperament. So what is the outline for today? We are going to be looking at definitions of temperament. And when we get into it, you'll realize why it's not just a single definition. We will be looking at the different types of child temperament. So we're going to be talking about under-controlled children, over-controlled children, easy, difficult, inhibited, all the different types. We are going to be talking about how temperament is continuous. So this is, in a way, a follow-up to what Bethany talked about last week when we discussed the Caspi article. So we're going to be looking at more evidence to show why temperament is continuous. And then we're also going to look at how temperament is either genetically determined or environmentally shaped, and whether it's even an or situation, or how we're going to be looking at it. And I will also maybe at some point talk about why MBTI is not my favorite thing in the world. And so I put up this meme just to kind of, I don't know, I just looked at it and I was like, that's not how it works, and we're going to find out why. So what is temperament exactly? Temperament, in the most basic sense, is an initial state of being. So when a child is born, it's going to show certain behaviors. There are going to be certain ways in which they're going to act, which is what temperament is, because you can see temperament as young as 2 months of age. So, and we're going to be looking at evidence of that as well. So it's an initial state of being, and this is from where personality develops. So when people are talking about personality, it's actually developing out of temperament, which is why that makes temperament a pretty important thing to study. Oh, okay. So temperament is individual differences in emotional, motor, and attentional reactivity. And this is all genetically based, according to Rothbard. So we measure these differences in several different ways. And once we talk about Rothbard more, we'll get into these. So there's length of time the child takes to respond to certain things, the intensity of response, how strongly are they positively or negatively reacting to something, recovery of response. So if there's a very strong negative response, how long is it taking the child to get out of that? How long does it take them to recover from that negative state? And also a little bit of self-regulation, which is a class by itself. So we're going to be doing that in a couple of weeks too. And there's also the point that, again, so effortful control, ability to suppress a response in favor of a more socially acceptable response. This, again, we're going to be talking about a lot when we do self-regulation and emotion regulation in later weeks. But within temperament, we are going to be talking about it. And in here, it's going to be termed as effortful control. So the first thing that we need to kind of get into to understand what temperament is that there's these behavioral styles that are emerging early, like we said. They are biologically driven, and they're going to reflect certain responses which help us predict how this child is going to respond in several different situations. And the reason why, like I said, there are definitions to temperament is because theorists just cannot agree. Okay, so ever since temperament started to be talked about in psychology, there has been a lot of dissent about how exactly it should be defined. So we're going to look at 3 different ways in which temperament has been theorized, and then we're going to get together and see what that means. So the first one is the dimensional approach. So this was given by Thomas and Chess in 1977. So they started working with a data set which was based in New York. And they came up with these 9 dimensions that they thought temperament was made up of. So there's sensitivity. So how sensitive are you to the stimuli in your environment? How sensitive are you, and how much do you react to certain things? Intensity of reaction. So like we said, how strongly are you reacting to these things? So if there is something in your environment, a stimuli that you may not like for a certain reason, how intensely are you reacting to it? Activity level. So for children in particular, there are some children that you've probably seen with siblings or cousins, nieces, nephews. There are kids who are very, very active, then there are kids who are more quieter, and what's the difference there, and how is that, differing from child to child? So that's what activity level is about. Adaptability. This kind of comes into the idea of when you put a child into a novel situation. So a kind of situation which is new to them, a situation which they're not used to, it's not part of their routine. How are they able to adapt to that situation, right? So if you put them in there, do they have a really intense reaction to it and they just completely lose control? Or are they able to adapt themselves to that situation and kind of get used to it? The next one is approach withdrawal. How much does the child like to approach other people? Or when they're put into a social situation, do they withdraw from others in that situation? So that's what approach withdrawal is about. Persistence, basically attention span. When you give a task to a child, how long are they able to keep their attention on it? Are they persisting or are they not? Rhythmicity. So rhythmicity is about bodily functions, actually. So for toddlers, babies and toddlers in particular, do they have a routine? Are they eating? Do they expect to be fed at particular times? Are they going to the bathroom at particular times, or is that not happening? How is their rhythmicity in everyday functions? Quality of mood, pretty much about, whether it's negative, positive, how it is, what their emotions are like. And the last one is distractibility. Are they very easily distracted from tasks, or are they able to, again, pay attention to what they're doing and for how long? So it kind of ties in with persistence. Thomas and Chess believed that all individuals are falling along some continuum on each one of these dimensions. So all of us score something on each one of these dimensions. It could be a low score, it could be a high score, but we all have some level of all of these qualities in us, and that's what makes up temperament. And I put in goodness of fit here because goodness of fit is something that Thomas and Chess talked about a lot, and we're gonna go back to it a little bit later, but their idea was that based on how you're scoring on all of these different things and how socially acceptable those scores are, your goodness of fit is gonna be determined from that. And that's also what temperament is about. How well do you fit into the environment that you are born into? And that kind of determines whether or not you're looked at as an easy kid or a difficult kid. If you have, for example, a very high score on adaptability, you're probably going to be looked at as an easy kid because you're able to adapt in new situations. But if you have a very high score on intensity of reaction, probably means that you have very strong reactions to new situations. And in some cases, in a social situation, that's going to be looked at as difficult. So we're going to go back to that a little bit later. So this is Dr. Thomas. So we're going to actually hear a little bit of this. Let me know if you can hear the
husband and wife team of Dr. Alexander Thomas and Dr. Stella Chess.
Temperament to be described has to be distinguished from some other qualities. So let me start with that. If one talks about what children do, there are such things as what they can do. Now that involves abilities, intelligence, talents, and so forth, the capacities that a child has. Then there's the question of motivation, which is the reasons why a child will do something. That brings us to temperament, which is the style with which a child behaves.
After years of experience in public and private practice, Dr. Chess and Dr. Thomas noticed that their training had ignored a critical factor.
And we found very early that our psychoanalytic training simply did not take account of what was going on between parent and child. And it took about 10 years to get firmly in our heads that it had to do with certain kinds of individual differences, which we had seen in our own children early on and had noticed in the children of friends as they grew up, and we saw them grow up. And then we began to do our work by interviewing parents of newborn children, carrying on for 2 years, working out a series of attributes, which we called individual differences in childhood.
I might add that if something developed in the child's behavior, which was deviant in any way from the traditional, normal, quote, child, that this must have been the fault of the parents. And it just didn't fit with us. While that was true with many parents, sometimes very good parents had children who had problems, and on the other hand, some parents who were not good mothers, in quotes, but yet had good children.
The style that makes one child different from another is the child's particular mix.
Okay, so the reason why I wanted you to see that was kind of to get at the point of why they actually developed this system, right? Because as they talked, they kind of looked at parent-child relationships, and like they said, in not very probably politically correct language, but for parents who are bad parents, sometimes their children turn out well. And then for parents who are good parents, quote unquote, their children may sometimes turn out quote unquote bad. So that's why they wanted to look at all of this and try to figure out what was it that was making these children act in a particular way, and whether there was something other than parenting which was affecting this whole situation and narrative. So, okay. So that was the dimensional approach by Thomas and Chess, which is probably one of the most popular approaches to temperament. Now, like we talked about, there's 9 dimensions that they talk about. So it's kind of long and a little bit tedious to be talking about temperament always in just these 9 dimensions. So what happened was other theorists came up with a slightly different way of looking at it. And so they came up with typological approaches. So there's one typology which looks at easy, difficult, and slow to warm children. And then there's the other typology by Rothbard, which talks about how children score on scales of effortful control, negative affectivity, and extroversion surgency. So we're going to be looking at that. So the first typology that we're going to be looking at is by Fox and Henderson. And they talked about how children can be categorized as easy, difficult, and the middle was slow to warm or inhibited kids. So what does this really mean? So easy or well-adjusted children in their study was around 40% of the children. And these children are high in regularity and adaptability. They readily approached novel situations. That's a tiny typo there. And so this is what they kind of categorize these children as. So easy children were, as the word suggests, in even our everyday language, we would kind of refer to certain kids as easy, and that's what they talked about as well. Thomas and Chess also talked about these kind of children, and they had this to say is that the parents of an easy child may be pleased and even grateful that they have to exert relatively little effort, time, and attention to the child's care. This may have a positive effect on the parent-child relationship, stimulating expansion and growth of parental love and affection, and in turn enhancing the child's sense of being wanted and loved. In other instances, however, the needs of the easy child may be ignored because he or she adapts so quickly and fusses so little. So this does bring up an issue which, even though we don't see as much with easy kids as we see with inhibited kids, but this is a point, is that for easy and inhibited kids, sometimes they are so adaptable that we don't always pay attention to what kind of issues they may be having because they just don't display the sort of reaction they're having as much as difficult kids might be. So the second one, again, so is difficult or under-controlled children. And in Fox and Henderson's study, this was around 10% of the children. These kids are high in intensity of response and considerable negative affect. So they have very, very strong negative reactions to certain situations. They withdraw in response to novel situations. So if you put them in a new situation, they're going to try and get away. They don't want to be there. They don't like the change in their routine. They don't want to have to engage with this sort of new environment that they're being put in. They have limited or low adaptability. So like I said, if you put them in a new situation, they really don't want to adapt to it. They want to be out of it. And they have irregular body functions. So sleeping, eating, going to the bathroom, everything is kind of out of routine, whatever their routine might be. And so it's very, very difficult sometimes to predict what these children might require. And so that makes it a lot harder for the parents as well. And that's what Thomas and Chess talked about as well. So they said that parents can hardly ignore a difficult child. Parents may feel threatened. They may believe they are unconsciously rejecting their child or unloving or just plain inept as caretakers. Or the parents may blame the infant. Finally, the parents may be intimidated by the infant's frequent loud screaming and resistance to training procedures. In all these cases, they can hardly provide the patient gradual and repeated exposures to new situations that such a child requires to make a positive adaptation. A vicious cycle is created. So for these difficult kids, and this is, going off of the video, this is why they really wanted to look at temperament, is to understand how to help parents deal with children who are categorized as quote unquote difficult, because parents may be trying, but then the child is so resistant to any sort of support from the parents that the parents may get discouraged. And so that's the kind of vicious cycle that they're talking about, is that even if the parents try to help, the child is not ready to take the help, and it just continues. The last type that Fox and Henderson talk about are slow to warm or inhibited children. So this is around 15% of children. And also, as you can probably tell, the total of all these percentages do not add up to 100, because there's always some children who cannot be categorized in just one of these three. They might be a mix of three, and so they were not included in this in these numbers. So for an inhibited child, they have low activity and they're slow to adapt. They withdraw in response to novel situations, and they have somewhat negative mood. So they do share certain characteristics or traits with difficult children, but the main difference in between these two groups is their reaction to these different situations, to these novel situations. They don't really have much of an intensity of response. Even if they're unhappy or distressed by the new situation, they'll probably keep it to themselves, and there's no intensity of response. And in most cases, they will slowly adapt to this novel situation as well. They're not gonna want to completely run away from it like a difficult child might. They're gonna stay there, they're gonna slowly adapt to themselves, which is why they're called slow to warm and inhibited. So Kagan, another theorist who looked at inhibited children in a lot of his studies, provided this sort of list of characteristics. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but if when you're going through it, you'll realize the top, these are these behavioral markers, and then the bottom 8 to 15 are physical markers. So there's a lot of these different ways in which you can tell if a child is inhibited. And this is pretty helpful for teachers or even for parents to understand maybe what they should be doing with their children. So you can go through this later. This is more for your information, but it might help you get a better idea of how we're differentiating these inhibited children who are somewhat in the middle from easy and difficult children. So given these two, so we talked about Thomas and Chess's dimensional approach, and now we talked about Fox and Henderson's typological approach of looking at easy, difficult, and slow to warm. And so this table brings all of that together because Thomas and Chess also at some point differentiated and categorized those 9 dimensions based on easy, difficult, and slow to warm characteristics. And so that's what this table here tells you, is that based on those 9 characteristics, where would a child fall when they're easy, when they are slow to warm, and when they are difficult. Again, this is a more helpful sort of graphic for people in practical situations to see whether they can help provide supports to a child who might be displaying these certain characteristics. So the last one that we're going to be looking at within the typological approaches is by Rothbard. So this approach is also a typological approach, and it kind of, she gave a slightly different idea of temperament, because like we talked about till now, we are kind of categorizing children very much so into these boxes, right? So either a child is easy, or they are difficult, or they're going to be slow to warm, right? So we're not really leaving any room for doubt on what they actually might be doing on an everyday basis. We're just getting one score for them, and we're putting them into that box forever, maybe in some cases. But what Rothbard tried to do was, she came up with these 3 different traits, and children had different scores on each of these traits, and you didn't box the children or categorize them into one particular thing. You had to look at it as a whole and try and understand their temperament in different situations, in different contexts. So this, I use this typology in my research, which is probably why I like it. But so it helps you get a more holistic picture of the child. So the first thing is effortful control in these traits. What is it comprised of? It has attention control. So whether or not the child is able to shift attention and focus on a different task when they're presented with it. Inhibitory control. So are they able to suppress inappropriate responses or responses that at a particular time are not required from them or are not expected from them, and plan for future action? How good are they at that? Perceptual sensitivity, ability to perceive low intensity stimulation in surroundings. So how perceptive are they? How sensitive are they to certain stimuli in their surroundings? You know, it could be like, does it have to be in their face, something big happening, and that's the only way you can catch their attention? Or are they able to perceive that, okay, there's certain changes happening in my environment and I can change based on that? And then there's low intensity pleasure. So they can derive pleasure from low intensity activities. It doesn't have to be that they're gonna get ice cream every day at school. That's not gonna be the only thing that makes them happy. Even being able to play with the toy that they really like during playtime, or being able to talk to a friend. All of these things, which may be, I guess low intensity pleasure is the idea of enjoy the small things, as people would say in regular everyday talk, that's what low intensity pleasure is all about. The next one is negative affectivity. So this is indexed by frustration, makes sense, related to interpretation of ongoing tasks. So how well are they focusing attention on a certain task, and how quickly are they getting frustrated with it? Fear. So if they're in distress, if they're fearful of something, how are they displaying it? How is that happening? What kind of negative affect are they showing when they are fearful? Discomfort. If they're in a situation that they don't like, what are the in what ways are they reacting to those sensory qualities of that situation? If they're somewhere where it's very loud, how are they reacting to that? What kind of discomfort is being sort of exhibited by them because of that? Sadness, the most I guess kind of easiest thing to look at is how much do you think they're suffering? How disappointed are they by something? If something is taken away from them, if there's object loss, how are they reacting to it? And the last one is suitability. So if they do face distress, how are they recovering from it? Or even when they're getting really excited, how are they able to come down from that excitement onto a more neutral level? So all of this together makes up negative affectivity. The last one is extraversion surgency. So this includes, firstly, activity. So gross motor activity that the child is displaying. How active are they? Low shyness. So this is kind of reverse coded, but if there's certain inhibitions to novelty, to being in novel situations or a challenging situation that's presented to them, how prepared are they to deal with such a situation? That's going to tell you about how they score on low shyness. High intensity pleasure. So for children who score high on extraversion surgency, they derive pleasure from high intensity activities. So it has to be something very, very new or novel, or it has to be something that's really, really big in their terms. So like I said, if they get ice cream at the end of the day, that's going to be something that makes them really, really happy. But they might have not been happy the whole day, because even though they were able to play with their favorite toy, or they were able to talk to their best friend, that does not make them as happy as having something that's very novel. So having ice cream at school is not really a very common experience. So that's going to be a novel thing, and that's going to be something that gives them happiness. Smiling and laughter. So this is kind of the opposite of negative affect. If you're showing positive affect, and affect in this sense, I should have probably said, affect is another word for emotions here. So negative affect was what kind of negative emotions you're showing, and positive affect is smiling and laughing. What kind of positive emotions are you displaying? Impulsivity, speed of response initiation. When you are in a situation and you're getting some stimuli from the environment, how impulsive are you? How quickly are you showing your reaction to that certain stimuli? Or are you able to hold back on certain reactions and kind of, have that inhibitory control? So this, in a way, is an opposite of inhibitory control. Then we have positive anticipation. So what kind of excitement do you get for certain pleasurable activities? Going back to the example of getting ice cream at school. How excited do you get because of that? Because you know that it's Friday and our teachers told us that at the end of the day, we're going to get ice cream. The positive anticipation, how much is it? So that's positive. And then the last one is affiliation, which is pretty much how how well do you take social interactions? How much do you seek out, deeper friendships with others? And for children at young ages, it could be in several different ways. It might not look the same as it looks for adults and adolescents, but it's just a desire for closeness and warmth with others. Bethany and I spent a lot of time doing observations in Head Start centers with preschool children, and some of the days really just want to come up and give you a hug because maybe they're missing out on some sort of affection at home, or there might be something going on. And sometimes they just want to come up and give you a hug, or they just want to sit with you and cuddle. And so that's what affiliation is about. How much are you able to, you have to have a desire for that closeness, but also are you able to actually initiate that? So that's what affiliation is all about. So before we go on, I'm gonna check the chat if you have questions. And also I'm gonna put up a poll because having talked about, okay. So I want you to kind of see, how would you classify your temperament? Do you think you're easy, difficult, inhibited, or you think other? So it's like, yeah, I'm kind of like a mix of different things. I don't think I fit into one thing. So if you would take some time. Okay. All right, we're waiting on a few more people. All right, almost all of you voted. So I am gonna share results. I hope everybody can see that. So as you can see, most of you, well, by a very close margin, said you would classify your temperament as easy. The second one is inhibited. So 42% of you said you were inhibited. Me too, yay for slow to warm kids. And then 14% of you said other, and 1% said difficult. So that kind of gives you an idea that this is pretty much how, I guess, most studies would also find temperament classifications to be. All right. So questions at the end of this? Any really interesting questions you had based on all of this? Okay. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at is development of temperament, right? So we talked about what temperament was all about. We talked about the different ways in which it's defined. And now we're going to talk about how it actually develops over time.
Someone had a question in the chat. Sorry, I just wanted to let you know.
Whoops. Percentages are different when it's not self-report, because there's probably, yes. So that's actually a very interesting question. So for temperament, given that we look at babies, usually it is a measure that is filled out by parents. So yes, it is definitely kind of a different approach, but then you can't ask babies to fill out a form, so there's no other way of really knowing, even though we will look at another study by Kagan where he has a different way of doing it. But yes, so when it's not self-report, a lot of parents would probably say, yes, my child is very difficult. So
yeah,
that does make sense.
These like categories of temperaments are not generally applied to like older kids or adults.
So not really, because like we talked about, so personality develops out of temperament.
Because most adults aren't going to say, oh, I'm difficult, or I mean, they might, but you know, versus like being inhibited, you know, being shy or like reserved isn't necessarily like as stigmatized, you know, like to the point where people.
Yeah, absolutely. And also something that we'll talk about a little bit more towards the end is that the way I look at temperament, and, you know, basing it on all the different studies that I have read, there is this sort of, there's a way in which we kind of deal with the difficult parts of our temperament, and that happens later on in life. Okay. But in the beginning, yes, you know, it's a lot more, because it's based on our parents, right? And so if they're having a hard time with us, they're probably gonna say we're difficult, but then in adulthood, we kind of learn how to deal with that difficult part of us. And so that's what makes up personality. Yeah. Christina, I was looking for your question. I can't exactly find it. So if you want to put it back in, or you can.
It wasn't me who did a question. I just want to let you know somebody was asking something.
Okay.
No, it's okay. I didn't have a question. Someone else did.
Okay. And Amr said, do developmental psychologists continue to study temperament? So, okay, yeah, we talked about that a little bit. Temperament, yes, in some senses. For example, the CASP study that we talked about last week did kind of use the same elements. So I think they looked at like under-controlled, over-controlled, and well-adjusted kids from what I remember. And they did, you know, use those same things over a longitudinal study. And so I think the age at which they looked at those people as adults, I mean, it was at an adult age. So yes, some studies do that, but I feel like temperament is mostly used for early childhood studies, or maybe up to, you know, middle childhood as well. But later on, theorists don't really focus on it as much. Okay. I hope that kind of answers your question, Amr. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna go on then. Thank you. I love talking about temperament, so I'm glad you have questions. Okay, so development of temperament. So this is when we talk about, if this will move, what are the ages? So when I started off, I did talk about the fact that temperament is something that shows up very early, right? So by 2 to 4 months of age, we're able to see temperament. And this is what we're talking about here. These differences and how the environment is influencing them has a kind of a timeline, right? So there's these temperamental characteristics. And obviously, as with everything in psychology, we can't say for sure that every child is going to be showing these characteristics and traits exactly at the same times. But in general, between 2 to 3 months, distress, avoidance, anger, approach, all of these kind of reactions start developing, right? And even if you think back to a baby maybe that you've you know, seen closely, when they're between these ages of 2 to 3 months, they start kind of recognizing their parents. They don't want to be just handed off to anybody. They will show distress if that happens. They can show anger if their parent is not responding to them when they start crying, and all of these different kind of things. With approach, it's usually with a parent or a caregiver, but it could also be that they're just easy kids and they want to approach everybody, right? So that also kind of ties in with temperament. Then, so between 2 to 3 months, that happens. Then once the baby starts getting into this period of 7 to 10 months of age, they'll start showing behavioral inhibitions or fear. So at that point of time, when they are like at a younger age, maybe they'd still be okay with being handed off to somebody they've not seen before. But at this 7 to 10 months of age, they start getting fearful. They just don't know what's happening. They don't get why their parent is handing them off to this other person. And there's this inhibition that starts developing there. So that's between 7 to 10 months. And then by around 30 months, so that's like what? A little more than 2 years, effortful control starts developing, right? So What does that mean? This is why at that age, children are, parents are toilet training their kids. They're trying to teach them how to use the potty and not just use diapers. So that's because effortful control is starting to develop now. So the child learns that, yeah, it's a lot easier for me to just pee into my diaper, but now I have to learn how to control that urge and do it in a different way. So at the end of it all, at the end of this part, the take-home points. There is no single definition of temperament, as we can probably tell. But there are a few common things that pretty much all theorists of temperament believe to be true. Firstly, temperament is somewhat genetically based, but it's environmentally shaped. So that again kind of goes back to whether or not, how continuous this is. Again, we're going to be talking about that as well. But it is based on your genes, which is why you start displaying it so young. But once you're actually born and you're in these surroundings, you're in an environment that is sort of reacting to you and you're reacting to it, that does shape your temperament as well. Second thing, it's comprised of a wide range of behaviors and physical factors, right? So there's not just one or two things that we can look at and say, okay, this kid is this temperament or this kid is this temperament. There's a lot of things that we need to put together and kind of get to this holistic picture, right? Because, and this is what my master's thesis was about, is that if you use only a few things to categorize children into certain temperamental groups, there's a possibility that you're going to overlook certain things for these kids later on. Because, for example, if there's a kid who is overall easy because he or she doesn't display any, extremely intense reactions to novel situations, and according to teacher ratings or parent ratings, he's an easy kid. But then if you have the opportunity to observe him or her for a longer period of time in classrooms, you might realize that they're not actually being able to connect with other people as much. They might be always sitting at the edge of a playgroup because they just don't know how to break into it and how to talk to their peers. So there might be certain inhibited characteristics in this kid. And if we know that, we can give them those supports. So the idea at the end of it is that temperament needs to be a holistic picture. You can't just use one or two factors and then say, yes, I have a great idea of what temperament is. And the last thing is, which is what we actually talked about this whole time, is that you can use either dimensions, which was Thomas and Chess's the 9 dimensions, or typologies. So easy, difficult, slow to warm, or using Rothbard's typologies of effortful control, negative affectivity, and extroversion surgency to describe temperament, or you can use a mix of all of this, right? So the idea here is that temperament is a foundation from which personality develops. And based on the theorist, there's going to be different ways in which it's looked at. You don't have to worry about that too much right now. But so that's the idea of temperament and why there's so many different ways in which we look at it. Okay, now we come to the question of continuity, right? So Bethany, again, talked about the Caspi article last week, and that is pretty much talking about how, so Caspi used the sample from the Dunedin study in New Zealand, which is a longitudinal sample. So they followed people from, I think, like 3 months of age or even younger, I'm not exactly sure, but up to adult age. So they have a lot of data. And for some reason, their attrition rate was kind of low. So it was great. It was good for them because they had data from a lot of people for a really long amount of time. And they showed in that study that temperament at a very young age can predict the outcomes for somebody at a much older age. And that's what we're going to be talking about here, is that there's certain things. So if you look at these: extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, these are three elements that personality literature talks about. And Rothbard found that temperament can be used to predict these different things, so into adulthood.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So I noticed that largely follows like the big five of personality traits. Is that just too young to measure openness to new experiences, or was there a reason for leaving that out?
As in, I'm sorry, I can't see your name because there's just a lot of people.
You know,
but,
you're fine.
So are you asking why openness to new experiences is not included in temperament?
Yeah, so, or if these just have like nothing to do with the big five, because like I think it leaves out
Right.
and agreeableness.
So you're saying why in this study by Rothbard she didn't look at those. So I think it's possible that those factors just didn't have much of a significant relationship to temperament, and that's why she focused more on these three. But I would also think, so openness to new experiences is, in a kid's terms, it's kind of like being in a novel situation, right? So for them, new experiences could be a kid's first day at preschool. So temperament does sort of, I mean, given that it's the foundation for personality, most of the things that we look at in the big five do somewhat derive from these ideas of temperament, but not all of them will be as strongly linked or have much of a significant, show that much of continuity, if that makes sense. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure. All right, any other questions? All right, so socially withdrawn toddlers and preschoolers, this is, okay, typically display common temperamental characteristics in infancy, right? So this is something like, so for example, there's fear in infancy, right? For kids who may be scoring high on the fearfulness factor within, I think it was negative affectivity within Rothbard's typologies, could predict more empathy, conscience, and guilt later on for 6-year-olds. So there is definitely continuity. There's a lot of evidence to show that. Then there's children who are negative, impulsive, unregulated, and they tend to have poor peer relations, get in trouble with the law. They are also difficult partners and roommates. So, so this is a little bit generalized. Let's always keep that in mind, that just because you are a particular temperament during infancy and toddlerhood and childhood does not mean that there's no way for you to get around it once you grow up. But the reason why this is there is that there is evidence to show that sometimes this could be the case. So there is continuity, right? We're not trying to prove here that if your temperament is difficult, you're going to be difficult all throughout your life. Like I said, I believe that whatever your temperament might be, when you're growing up, you learn how to deal with those difficult parts of your temperament, and you adapt better, and you learn how to realize your full potential in a sense. But when we're talking about just continuity, yes, there is evidence that whatever your temperament is as a child, there is going to be some way in which that will predict how you will function as an adult or an adolescent. So, and for this, we're going to talk about Kagan, who actually did a lot of work with inhibited babies. And so he actually did this study where he was able to show that when he looked at certain groups of babies with certain characteristics, and then he looked at them again at an older age, he could predict whether they would be shy children or sociable children when they were maybe in preschool. So he looked at two groups, which were highly reactive babies. So that was around 20% of the kids in his sample. And he said that they displayed high motor activity. So there was a lot of tension in their arms and legs. And we're going to look at a video, so that's going to make it clearer. And then they were also very irritable and distressed by any sort of new situation or something that was presented to them. These highly reactive kids, Kagan said, became shy and inhibited preschoolers, okay? So for highly reactive kids, they became inhibited preschoolers. Then, and they also displayed greater social phobias when they were adolescents. The next group that he looked at were low reactive kids, and this was around 40% of the children. These children displayed, you know, almost no tension or very little tension in their arms and legs when they were in the experiment. And they didn't have much of movement, and they were smiling, and they were just generally happy with themselves. These kids, these babies, grew up to be sociable, outgoing preschoolers and displayed considerably less fear later on. So what his study is trying to do. Hey, oh. Okay, I'm not sure. Okay, so for these children, he divided them up into these two different qualitative groups, right? He did not really look at temperament as a continuum here. He's looking at two very different groups, and that's how he believes temperament is. So.
Hey, Sanchari.
Yes.
We have a question in the chat.
I don't like that I can't see the chat when I am sharing screens. Okay. Could it be that high reactive kids mainly turn out shy because all their parents responded similarly to their high reactions, such as inhibiting them? It's possible. It's definitely possible because, yeah, like we talked about, that environment, which includes parenting, does affect how temperament will turn out. So yeah, it's pretty much, it's definitely a factor that parenting will affect how a baby might react to different situations. Yeah. There's no, I don't think there's like a direct reference to parenting in Kagan's work, but yes, I believe that could be possible. I hope that kind of answers the question. And now if I can find my mouse again, okay. Any other questions?
Nope, that's it for now.
Alrighty. Okay, let's do the video and then let's see if there's more questions.
It's wonderful, babe.
Temperament is one interest of childhood observer Jerome.
Absolutely no tension at all. That we're finding differences among infants and children will come as no surprise to anybody. Remember the old rhyme, Monday's child is fair-faced, Wednesday's child is full of wool. What we are discovering, which is relatively new, is that there is a large set of temperamental categories. We don't know how many scientists will eventually discover. We happen to be focusing on two of them. What is most surprising and very gratifying to all of us is that we're able to predict those two types of children from a very simple behavior when that child is 4 months old.
Kagan says certain reactions in 4-month-olds foreshadow future shyness or sociability.
Socialization reflects that children becoming increasingly exciting.
Oh, I just saw the messages about, is it fine now or?
Kind of going in and out. So could you describe what he's talking about in the video?
Okay, so we pretty much saw all of it, but so basically the experiment, as you saw, was babies were brought in. They were categorized either as highly reactive or low reactive, and then they dangled a toy in front of them, which sounds really, really mean, but that's what the experiment was. And while they were dangling the toy in front of them, they were observing what kind of reactions did the babies have to that. So for the highly reactive babies, when they had this toy dangling in front of them, they were interested. Actually, we didn't see that part, but so let's talk about the low reactive babies. When a toy was dangled in front of them, they showed interest. They were like, huh, this looks interesting. I wonder what it is, etc., etc. And there was not much tension in their arms and legs. They were just chilling, basically, in their little carrier while they had a toy in front of them. For the high reactive babies, on the other hand, when the toy was dangling in front of them, they looked at it for a bit, but then they started getting distressed by it. They were distressed by the fact that maybe they couldn't reach it, or the fact that they didn't know what was going on. There was a lot of tension. They were thrashing around in their carriers. And for the baby in this video, maybe I'll just put it without the sound. So this is the low reactive baby. As you can see, they're smiling. And this is the high reactive baby. And he just starts thrashing right away. He's making a lot of noise, and he's just really not liking it. And at one point, he just gets overwhelmed by it and he starts crying. And you can see it there, he starts crying there. So the idea is that for these kids, Kagan said that, as we saw in the, whoops, nope, don't want that. That these high reactive babies would become shy, inhibited preschoolers, and the low reactive babies he found became sociable preschoolers. And so his point was that yes, there's continuity, and we can use temperament to predict what later outcomes are going to be like. Okay, questions? Oh, you're saying it was too high. Okay, I'm learning. Okay. So any questions for that? I'm guessing no? Okay. Let's move on. So now that we've kind of talked about all of this, okay, so it's 4. Should we do our break now? We can do our break now. Okay, so this is, I think, a good point to stop. Let's do a 10-minute break. So it's 4:03 on my clock. So by 4:13 in 10 minutes, we're gonna come back and start again. Okay, I think most of you are back. All right, so we're gonna continue, and so till now, what all did we talk about? We talked about the different definitions of temperament. We talked about the different ways in which it has been theorized. So we looked at the dimensional approach. We looked at the typological approaches. We also looked at why temperament is, not why, but we saw evidence which showed that temperament is continuous. So there is continuity. And so we can use it to predict later outcomes. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is about the genetic foundations of temperament, right? So we've already talked about how temperament is one of the most biological based kind of parts of our psyche, for want of a better phrase, but we've learned how it's kind of biologically determined. And so we're now going to look at whether temperament is genetic. So there is research to show that temperament is influenced by genetics, but it does not completely determine who we become, right? So this is going back to what I said for one of the previous slides, is that yes, there is a certain biological basis, genetic basis, neural basis for what your temperament as a baby is. But then there's a lot of context and environment and your surroundings and things in your surrounding which will affect how that influences you as an adolescent or as an adult. So genetics is a factor, but it's not the last final say on how you will be. So children are born with a neural makeup for temperament. And so Fox and colleagues, this was another study that was done by Fox, where he determined that shy and outgoing infants show brain activity in different hemispheres of the brain from, there's, so basically what he was trying to prove here is that there is a certain neural difference, there is a certain genetic difference. So it's not just a question of whether or not this is the case, but it's more a question of, yes, this is the case, and how do we deal with it? So they did, I think it was an MRI, and they saw different brain activity in different hemispheres of the brain, and as compared to average children. So for shy and outgoing children, or infants, I should say, there was brain activity in different hemispheres, but for an average child, who in other terms we can probably call the easy child here, brain activity was same for both hemispheres of the brain. So yes, there is a neural difference in the brains of an easy child versus an inhibited child. But also, as we've talked about a little bit, is that personality at the end of the day is an interaction between genes, temperament, and the environment, parents included, right? Parents and caregivers have an effect. And kind of going back to one of the questions one of you posed was about whether different parenting might affect the way in which highly reactive kids might turn out to be inhibited children later on, right? So parenting definitely has an effect there. So then there's also physiological differences, right? So which again we saw in Kagan's study. So there's these kind of particular ways in which babies react to certain situations, and that's not learned because these babies are so young that it's not possible for them to have learned it already in some way. So there is some sort of biological basis to this, right? And Kagan, I don't think we actually, I'm gonna go back to this one slide because it's sort of, I wish I did not use animations. Okay, so this one here, this table, which is from Kagan's work, the last one, if you look at the 15th point here, he actually believed that a physical marker of an inhibited child would be an ectomorphic body build with a narrow face and light blue eyes. This is not it. This is because his sample was majority or probably fully from a white population. I cannot suddenly grow blue eyes just because I'm an inhibited person, okay? So kind of just to remind you guys that we do look at a lot of literature from white psychologists, and so their samples were also white, and so sometimes the results that they got and the conclusions that they drew from that is also kind of racially stereotyped. So, you know, think about it in that sense when you're kind of, you know, thinking about temperament later on as well. Temperament and culture, so that is the next thing we're going to do, so I'm not going to talk about it right now. Okay. I really need to be reminded not to use animation ever again. Okay, is this where we were? Yes. So physiological differences. I went back to that because that's kind of, according to Kagan, the physiological differences were having light blue eyes as one of the factors. But again, just trying to put it out there that it does not include those physical markers. Physiological differences in this case could be just on Fox's study where they saw the differences in brain activity, not other things like ectomorphic body builds. So yes, genetics is playing a part. The next thing here is, does context matter? Okay, are there any questions? I see a comment or something.
There's an acronym put, yeah, I haven't heard that acronym before, but that's great.
I love that. Weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Yep.
Yeah, that's usually a problem with a lot of sampling in academia.
Yep, I 100% agree. There is some for temperament and culture, which is, we're gonna bring that up, but yeah, I'd say whatever, not just in this class, any psychology class you take, just keep that in mind, that the results that you're looking at are not always, but pretty much usually based, especially for sort of foundational theories, is based on a very Western sample. So yeah, thank you. That's an interesting acronym. I'm going to use that from now on. So does context matter? I didn't really keep this a secret. I've been talking about it since the beginning of the lecture. Yes, context does matter for temperament. So context includes, you know, your surroundings, your everything that your environment is made up of. It's parenting, it's the relationship you might have with siblings. For slightly older kids, so in preschool, it's the relationship you might be having with your teachers and your peers. It's also more different things such as the reactions of the transactional sort of interactions you might have with different people, how that affects things, a lot of different things. So does context matter? Yes, I'm going to answer that right away, but let's get into it. So there's basic biological processes of temperament, right? And there's kind of differences amongst cultures. And this is what we're going to look at now, because this is, again, research that I'm doing now. So yay. This is a study from the Rothbard article that you guys read, that you all read. And it talks about this connection between effortful control, and then we have extroversion surgency on the top, negative affectivity on the bottom. This article is by Rothbard, which is why we're looking at these things. And there is a comparison between Chinese kids and kids from the USA, okay? So what are we looking at here? We have the correlations between effortful control, extroversion surgency, and then effortful control and negative affectivity. As a reminder, I just put this up here in case, you know, it helps out because it might be confusing sometimes. I still sometimes get confused and I have to look it up. So for correlations, for correlation coefficients, the closer it is to 1 in either a positive or a negative, so it could be just 1 or -1, the closer it is to that, the stronger the relationship is. If it's positive, it means a stronger positive relationship. If it's negative, it's a stronger negative relationship. The closer this number is to 0, it means it's a weak relationship, okay? So now that we know that, what this study showed was that for Chinese children, the higher their effortful control, the lower their extroversion surgency was. For American children, the correlation was pretty weak, so it didn't really have that much of an effect. So that means for Chinese children, the more they were able to control, the more they were able to inhibit certain behaviors or certain actions, the less they scored on extroversion and surgency measures, right? So like you can see there, it meant they had maybe lower activity, less laughter or smiling, less of high intensity pleasure. So they got pleasure from, you know, low intensity things as well. Less impulsivity, less positive anticipation, and low shyness was already there. So that's the kind of relationship we see there. However, so that's already a difference between Chinese kids and American kids. In the next one, effortful control with negative affectivity, for higher the effortful control, the less negative affectivity that American kids showed, right? Because here for the Chinese kids, the correlation was not pretty weak, so you know, doesn't really make a difference. But for American kids, the more you were able to control, effortfully control your behaviors or certain reactions to certain stimuli, the less negative affect you showed, okay? So this kind of goes into the talk about temperament, is that yes, there is a difference in how your culture dictates what your temperament will be, okay? So I'm from India originally, and there is definitely a difference. And I can, you know, we can talk about how in India, and I know India and China share certain cultural, you know, beliefs and norms. And so, yes, in an Indian context, the more you're able to control your impulsive nature, the less you're going to be looked at as extroverted or surgent, which is good. So that's why children end up maybe lower on extroversion surgency, because in that society, that's what is given more precedence in a way, right? So there's also the case of goodness of fit here, right? So going back to a point that I made really, really early on, how well are you fitting in with your cultural situation? And if you are fitting in well, then you will be considered as an easy kid. And if you don't have goodness of fit, so that means you're reacting in ways which are not socially as acceptable, you're going to be looked at as a difficult kid. So for a Chinese kid who is, you know, controlling their impulses, being quiet, not showing too much of, you know, not showing a lot of reactivity to certain things, is goodness of fit within a Chinese setting. But if that same kid was put in an American school, it would not be the same thing, right? Because then they might be seen as too quiet, or they might not get the opportunity to be a part of peer groups, et cetera, et cetera. There are studies to show that peers in preschools don't know how to react to inhibited kids in their classrooms. So if there is an inhibited child in a preschool classroom, their peers sometimes won't know how to approach them or how to involve them with play, and so they just leave them. So talking about later outcomes, yes, inhibited kids might sometimes get left out from a lot of situations. And for the second one, the negative affectivity, the higher your effortful control, the lower negative affect you're showing in the US. So that means you can, I guess, control your negative emotions and show a more happy and cheerful personality. And that is because in the US, maybe sometimes expressing negative emotions is not as socially acceptable as it is to show that, you know, you're happy, you're good with things, you're like good to go, right? So yes, there's a difference. There is always going to be a cultural difference in how your temperament develops. Huge ramble. Any questions? I see one comment, if I can, but I don't know. Are there studies on temperament that we're looking at from Eastern cultures? So we have the Chinese study here. A lot of the studies with temperament, like cross-cultural studies, I should say, are with Chinese kids. I am trying to do research with Indian kids now, or Indian American kids, because long story short, basically, like there are studies for different Eastern cultures, but a lot of them are based on Chinese kids. I'm not exactly sure why, but that is probably the one that you'd find the most if you went and just search for temperament and culture on, you know, the library website or something. So we will not be looking at any other examples, but if you reach out to me, if you're really interested about it, I can send you a lot of stuff. So any other questions around temperament, culture? Okay, I'm not seeing any comments. Alrighty, so does context matter? Now we also know that yes, the degree to which an individual's temperament is sort of part of or matches in with his or her environment will predict development. And when we say predicting development here, meaning how is it going to predict what their temperament is going to turn out to be, right? Again, goodness of fit, like I talked about. Now, another thing that we're going to look at for context is how the type and quality of interactions can also shape temperament. So there are certain transactional processes that are shaping temperament, right? I kind of talked about it, but not completely. The first one is reactive transactions. So what does this mean? You have individual characteristics affecting two or more individuals' experiences of identical environments or conditions, right? So temperament impacts how environmental information is processed, okay? So for example, if you are, if you are a difficult child, okay, and you are in school and you are told that, I'm gonna pick on an example from one of my days of observation. You are a difficult child and you're told that day that you will not be going outside to the park to play. You're gonna have to play in the gym. Or maybe for preschools where there is no gym, you will just have to play in the classroom. For a difficult child, this might be very, very difficult. That was alliteration there. But the way in which they are processing this information is going to be different from how an easy child processes this information. An easy child hears, okay, it's raining, we can't go outside, you don't have a gym, so we're just going to spend that time for playing longer in the classroom. And the easy kid is like, okay, I mean, I have this toy that I really like and I can play with it. Okay, good. For a difficult child, it becomes a case of, oh my gosh, this is a complete change from what I was expecting and I don't like it. And both of these kids are processing the information which they're getting from the environment very differently. So this is a kind of reactive transaction that's happening between the individual and their environment. So that is firstly affecting them in some way or the other. But if you can think of this happening in a longitudinal way, so if there is a child who is growing up in a situation where there's these sort of difficult environmental stimuli being thrown at them every day, maybe try and think of children in a war zone, or maybe even children right now, Black children in this scenario, you know, they're getting to hear of really difficult situations every day. There is going to be some difference in the way in which they're going to process that information and how that's going to affect the way in which they react to it, right? So it's a transaction, as it says. It's a two-way process, and it is going to affect these children in different ways, and their temperament is probably going to be changed by it. The next one is an evocative transaction. What does that mean? There's individual differences evoking response from the environment, and then that's influencing the individual's response to the environment. Parenting is an example here, because if you, for example, think of a child who, you know, babies will cry when they're hungry. Now, so the crying for the baby is the kind of, you know, they're processing what they need and they're throwing out that reaction into the environment. They know somebody's gonna come, so they cry. And then as a result of that, a parent comes in, feeds them. So that's the response that they are getting from the environment. So it's an evocative transaction. They are trying to evoke a response from the environment when they're crying. And when the parents come in, that's the response that they're getting. And in this case, if you can think of an example of a child who might have neglectful parents, right? We're going to talk about all of that in a parenting lecture later on. But if there's a child with neglectful parents and the child cries and nobody comes and feeds that child, it's possible that in some way this is going to affect that child's temperament. Maybe they're going to become inhibited. There's a chance that even when they're hungry, they're going to cry a little bit, but then they realize that nobody's actually going to respond to that reaction of theirs. And they might sometimes just get quieter and quieter. Then there could be a baby with a difficult temperament who, or let's say is already an inhibited temperament. They cry, they don't get a response. They keep crying because they realize that that's the only way they're going to get any response. And they probably could learn from that they have to keep having this reaction, this negative reaction, or this negative response to their hunger to be able to get a response from somebody else. And so maybe later on they could become difficult kids because of that same reason. So evocative transactions will also have an effect. The last one is a proactive transaction. So in this case, it's a situation where the exchange of ideas, I guess, in a sense, is the strongest. So there's individuals who are moving beyond their original environments to actively construct new environments. And this can be seen with friends and peer groups, because this is for obviously slightly older kids, you know, starting in preschool or such, where you are proactively having an interaction with someone else, firstly, and you're getting responses from them, and it is affecting how you deal with your environment, right? Because, for example, you go to school on the first day, you don't know any of the other children, and you are sitting by yourself because you don't know who to interact with. You proactively go up to another peer, start talking to them, make friends, start playing. You're able to sort of break out of the situation that you were in, and situation in terms of you were sitting by yourself, you didn't know what to do, and you created that friendship and you got into that. So that's more proactive. And maybe you were an inhibited kid, but you took that first step towards reaching out to a friend. And that might help in some senses to minimize the effects of your inhibition, right? Questions?
Yes, and Chari, can we get one more example of a reactive transaction? We had a request in the chat.
Sure. So for reactive transactions, how else can we look at it? So it's about how, let's say, we have two babies who are both inhibited, right? And inhibited in the sense of like if their parents were asked to fill out a measure to score them on temperament, they came up as inhibited for that point of time. And they have to deal with, what kind of situation could it be? Two kids dealing with the same thing. I don't know. Let's say there's two babies in a hospital nursery. They're too young though. Let's say they're twins, even though this is not really gonna maybe work out in most situations. But let's say there's these two babies growing up together. They're in the same environment, and they are both inhibited based on parent reports. And at some point in time, they have to deal with, so within babies, there's this thing called contagious crying, okay? And this is not part of your syllabus. I'm just putting it out there to make an example. But usually when there's babies in nurseries, if one baby starts crying, there might be others who start crying as well. So it's called contagious crying. It's a phenomenon. So let's say that there's these two babies and they're at home, but then one of them starts crying, the other one starts crying as well. Let's think of an example where one of their mothers, let's not say they're twins, they're just separate babies. I'm just trying to make this on the fly, but one of the moms comes in, picks up her baby, and she realizes the baby is hungry, whatever, she feeds him or her. The other mom does not come in for whatever reason, right? So both of these babies start off as inhibited babies. They both started crying because of a response. One of them was a response to hunger. The other one probably started crying as a reaction. But then when the second baby keeps crying and does not get a response from the environment, it could affect the way in which this second baby is processing that information. For the first baby, the reaction was to cry as a result of hunger, and they got the response of the parent coming and feeding them. For the second baby, the baby cried, let's say as a response to hunger. They did not get any response, and so now they start processing that information differently, and they might think that the next time they cry, they still won't get any response, and so maybe this changes things for them. Like I said, for the evocative transactions, maybe the next time they won't cry as much, or they'll cry even more. So their temperament is kind of getting affected in that way. So it's a reaction of the baby to the environment based on how they process the response that they get from the environment. Does that help? I can send you other examples later on when I can think of more, but I don't know. I don't know if that helps somewhat. Okay, awesome.
I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
So I was just wondering because this is just like a process for like newborns and toddlers because like you know like they don't have like a cognitive understanding of the reality. That's why like all those like transactions are based on like classical conditioning instead of like more in-depth understanding of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yes, so for all of these, I guess the examples that I provided were all for babies because I guess that's kind of one of the easier ways to look at it. But you could, so for example, for proactive transactions, we are going into preschool age, right? Because that's usually when that sort of proactive interaction can start happening for kids. But if you think about even reactive or evocative transactions, you could think about them for older kids as well. So in that case, conditioning would not necessarily be the only reason why they're doing something. So, I mean, even at an adolescent or adult age, right? If, for example, you have an evocative transaction of, I don't know, like you say something to a friend expecting a certain response and you don't get it, you are probably going to change the way in which you ask for that same thing the next time, or you just won't ask for it, right? Because you didn't evoke the response that you were expecting. So even though it's not really temperament anymore in that sense, it's more of it's becoming more personality given that we're talking about an adolescent or an adult, but the idea is still the same, that it was an evocative transaction. It was meant to evoke a certain response from your friend, but you didn't get it, so you change the way in which you're going to do it later on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? How do you distinguish between reactive and evocative? That's a good question. So reactive transactions and evocative, the way in which I kind of, I guess, differentiate between the two is reactive transactions are not always necessarily are not always trying to evoke a response, but then evocative transactions are usually situations in which you are consciously doing something with the aim of getting something in return, if that makes sense. So for reactive transactions, yes, you are reacting to a certain stimuli, and then based on the response that you get from the environment, you change the way in which you are functioning in a sense, but then you're not necessarily, the action that you did was not necessarily with the aim, with some goal in mind. It could be pretty much any sort of action, and then the reactive transaction is more based upon how you processed the response that you got versus why you did that thing and what you were trying to evoke. That sounded rambly even in my own head, but so it's just, reactive transaction is kind of more about the process in which that transaction is happening, and the evocative transaction is more along the lines of the goal or the aim which you're trying to achieve.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right, I have another question. Can we connect this idea with like, I remember in Psych 100 we have like the positive and negative reinforcement. Basically, like the parents give like a stimuli and like a positive stimuli or like a negative one, and then we see how the child reacts. So like that's kind of like reactive and evactive, like they're like just, yeah, in a way.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of maybe like a reverse. So if we think of those transactions from the parents' point of view, yes, so like a positive reinforcement or a negative reinforcement is kind of an evocative transaction, because they are providing, let's say, their child with that reinforcement with a goal in mind, because you get to buy some toy that you've been wanting for a while if you complete your homework for a month in a row, right? So, or whatever a positive reinforcement would be. So they are trying to evoke a response from their child in that sense. So yes, I would say, and even for negative, you don't get to go out and play with your friends if you don't complete your homework for a week, So again, they're trying to evoke the response of the child doing homework. And in a sense, yeah, it is an evocative transaction. The only thing there is, yes, that we will, again, be dealing with personality and not temperament as much. So, but yes, it's kind of similar.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? No, go back.
Looks like there's one more question in the chat. Goes into peers, so I think you'll like that one.
Yay. Relatedly, when kids grow older and develop theory of mind, does social learning come into play? As a toddler, does observing how my peers and their parents interact have an impact on my own temperament? I would think so. I mean, I feel like for the age at which we look at temperament, so, early childhood or till middle childhood, it's, for preschoolers particularly, and this is based just off of my own observation of preschoolers, but they don't always worry as much about what kind of interactions other kids are having with adults, unless they are within that same kind of conversation or interaction in a way. So I'm trying to think if like a different reaction between their friend and their friend's parent would affect them. There's definitely social learning. I mean, I'm just not sure how much it would affect temperament as a whole. There might be a relation, but I can't say for sure. So, yeah. So I don't know if that it doesn't completely answer your question, Amar, but that's like the level of literature searching that I have done. So based on that, yes, social learning, I would imagine, would come into play, but I'm not completely sure about it. Okay, any other questions? Alrighty, we're gonna move ahead. Okay, so the basic idea from all of that and from all of your wonderful questions is that yes, parents, other individuals can shape their children's temperament. So there's different parenting practices that parents might be employing, or based on different parenting styles that they might have. And all of this will somewhat affect child's temperament, right? And the environment that the child is in, context, yes, it does matter. Bottom line, context does matter. Take home points from this whole thing. Temperament is both biologically based and environmentally shaped. There is a genetic basis to temperament, but then what happens in a child's environment and context also has an effect on how your temperament ends up to be. There is strong evidence of continuity from infancy through childhood and into adulthood for temperament. So again, even though there's going to be effects of different things on your temperament, there is continuity in some senses from childhood all the way up through adulthood. Parents, key caregivers, peers, siblings, teachers can shape temperament, okay? The sort of interactions you have with these people will affect the way in which you process that information and you understand what is expected from you. And in some cases, that's going to affect your temperament. So if there's like one sentence to like say everything, all the rambling that I did right now is that temperament is continuous, it's biologically based, and it's environmentally shaped. Okay? Questions? Because if I'm not wrong, that was the end of the presentation. No questions? So we have an activity, so we're gonna do that then if you have no questions for now. Alrighty. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and I can finally see you guys again. So yes, thank you, Bethany. So Bethany just sent out the worksheet, which you all are gonna be doing right now. And just like last time, we're gonna put you all into breakout rooms. Put your names on the sheets. This is gonna count towards your participation. This is not the only thing that counts toward participation, just to be clear, but it's part of it. And so yeah, you're gonna be looking at some questions related to temperament. And yeah, if I guess after we're all done, we're gonna come back and close it off. So I'm gonna put you, oh, I can't do that. Bethany, you're gonna have to put them in breakout rooms.
Shoot, my mute was on. I'll do breakout rooms.
Yes, I can't see that option somehow.
Okay, how many rooms do you want?
We can do like maybe 4 to 5 people in a room.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. And so for the questions I just saw, do we all turn it in? So 1 person per group is fine. Just decide amongst yourselves who is going to be turning it in, just as long as everybody's names is on it, okay? And are we working on this as a group? You're working on it as a group, and just kind of, you don't need to answer it like with your names in front of it or something if you don't want to. Just put in your experiences, okay? You don't have to agree on an answer. If you think there's differences in opinion, you can put that in as well. Yeah, no, that was one last thing is, so for turning it in, there is a group work folder, I think, right? Or within the folder for each week, or is it the main folder?
I'll add it right now. So
Yeah,
we'll have under the week 2 temperament folder.
Yeah, so there's gonna be a folder for group work under the temperament folder, and that's where you have to put it in. Alrighty, yes, I think that was the last question. I don't see any more, so yes, I think we're ready.
All right.